They also infiltrated the United States Army in earlier wars. Back to the Revolutionary War, we had Deborah Sampson, who served for 17 months in the Continental Army, and then she portrayed Robert Shirtliff. That was her persona back at the time. And then you had Lucy Brewer, and she served with the Marines aboard Old Ironsides as George Baker during the War of 1812. So this was once a really taboo topic, and modern historians are finally shedding light on the role that female soldiers played in the Civil War and women who made a living off of lying about their military service. So that will come in later. But the reason it was sort of a taboo topic is because when you're researching this, you really don't know what's true and what's not. It's really hard to find firsthand accounts. It's really hard to find reputable information. There have been entire books published by really great publishers, and it turns out everything in it is false. And we only know that now because, more light has been shed on the topic. So first I like to start and I talk about why would a woman want to dress up as a man and join the army in the 1860s. So one of the most common reasons was they would follow their husbands into war. This was an agricultural society in the 1860s. If you were a young woman that was left at home with no men in your family, your father went to war, your husband went to war, your brother, your uncle went to war, you were pretty much left to tend to the farm on your own. You were left to take care of the children. You were left to fend for yourselves. And for some women, that was just too daunting. They couldn't do it. Or they just really wanted to be with their husband or their fathers. So these women, during the Revolutionary War, they would go and they'd join the same regiment as their husband, obviously pretending to be a man. Some women just wanted the adventure. It's the same reason that women join the army today. Sometimes they just want to get out of the bubble of their own little town. At this time in the 1800s, we didn't have automobiles. You were probably only traveling 25 miles away from your homestead. In your lifetime, maybe 100 miles. So the adventure. Reliable wages. This was a really uncertain time in America, especially if you were in the agricultural industry. If the men are away and the women are left to care for the crops, you're probably not going to have a reliable wage. So the average Union soldier would make about $13 a month, and the average Confederate soldier, when they actually got paid, which didn't happen very often, made about $11 a month. So during the Civil War era, that was a really good, reliable wage for people. And then, of course, there was patriotism. Just like America during 9/11, the early 2000s, a lot of people just showed up and said, I want to fight for my country, I want to save the Union, or if you were in the Confederacy, you wanted to save your way of life. So patriotism drove a lot of the women that joined the fight. So this is a picture of me at the Ma and Pa Railroad smoking a cigar. My parents are super proud of this picture. So how did women disguise themselves? So most of the people fighting in the American Civil War were citizen soldiers at the time, and they didn't have any prior military training. So you could be fumbling around, you could be a mess not knowing how to march, not knowing how to shoot a gun, and it wouldn't tip them off. And then you had the medical examination at the time. You didn't have to take off your clothes, they didn't care if you had asthma, they weren't looking for heart murmurs. The only thing you needed was 2 teeth above 2 other teeth, and that was so you could rip the cartridge open. So it didn't matter where in your mouth those 4 teeth were, as long as you could rip open a cartridge and pour the ammunition and the black powder in your rifle, you were good to go. And of course you needed a trigger finger, but you could be an older person that had a limp and didn't walk very quickly, you could be an overweight person, you could be short, and you could be tall, you could be skinny, it didn't matter. They just wanted people to fill the ranks. So they weren't going to look at you too closely. And then women would just cut their hair short and they would bound their breasts flat. During the 1860s, women wore corsets, they wore hoop skirts to give you a very womanly figure. A corset's going to flatten your stomach and it's going to push your breasts up and give you a more curvaceous figure. When you take those off, you look completely different. I portray a soldier in the 87th, but I've also done portrayals as a woman, a civilian, and I look completely different when I'm wearing a corset and a hoop skirt versus wearing a Civil War uniform. And back then, if you had long, beautiful hair, you wore it up in hairstyles under bonnets. You didn't see women walking around with cropped hair unless maybe they had a disease that they had to cut their hair or lice. So you weren't looking for women with short hair like you would see today. Back during the Victorian era and the Civil War era, most soldiers slept fully clothed. I know when we go to reenactments, depending on the weather, you're still wearing your uniform to sleep, basically. You might just take your jacket and your shoes off. And you were bathing separately. If you were really bathing at all, you might just be going down to the river and splashing some water on your face. You're not really getting buck naked and jumping into the water because it might be cold. It might be, toward wintertime and you don't want to catch a cold. And then they avoided the public latrines. So latrines meant disease at the time. And dysentery was running rampant. Disease killed more soldiers than battle wounds did. So you weren't really trying to congregate where people were defecating and where there would be urine and flies and bugs. And then soldiers could go months, again, without fully bathing. So you were bathing, you were keeping yourself clean. You're not going to show up to dress parade dirty, but you're probably, again, not going to fully submerge yourself for a bath that you would have today. And then women experienced the loss of their menstrual cycles during the war. So if you were a female soldier that enlisted during the Civil War, one thing that's probably not going to give you away is your monthly cycle. Just like our elite athletes today that perform in the Olympics, think of gymnastics, their body fat is so low that they lose their menstrual cycles during the training period. So these are women that are experiencing hard conditions, physical demands. They're not getting 3 square meals a day. They're under extreme emotional distress. It's probably their first time away from home. They're losing weight. So they lose their menstrual cycle. So they don't have to worry about hiding that from the other soldiers. But if they did continue their menstrual cycle, you're at war. So blood is going to be very common. So it's not hard to hide it. Back then they didn't have tampons or pads, but they would have cloth pads and belts that you could put around your waist, sort of like a makeshift diaper almost. And if that got covered in blood, you could just say, hey, I hurt myself chopping wood. I got hurt in that last battle. I got hurt putting up the tent or foraging for food. And you're just going to throw that stuff in the woods. So it's really, a soiled rag with blood isn't going to draw attention when you're fighting in a civil war. That made the news. That picture, my parents were super proud of that one. So how did women disguise themselves? You were wearing a uniform that was ill-fitting. It was heavy wool, so it's going to disguise that shape of a woman's body. The average soldier is wearing a sack coat. It's called a sack coat for a reason. It doesn't have a shape. If you're looking to be stylish, a Civil War uniform is not for you. Do not join the Civil War reenacting community for the fashion. While some people can really pull it off, if you are a woman looking to pretend to be a man in cross-dress, the sack coat is for you. The trousers come up past your belly button. You're wearing suspenders. You're going to wear shirts that are baggy. You're going to have a hat on that's covering your hair. So it really isn't that hard for that shape to take on a more manly, less curvaceous figure. And then a lot of the soldiers were just young. They didn't have facial hair. They were probably boys fresh off the farm, 18, 19 years old. They might not have facial hair coming in. Their voices might not have dropped as low. So you can see why a woman in her late teens, early 20s would sort of mirror the same look or sound of a man of that age. And then women would adopt the typical male behaviors. You had to fit in, so you'd start swearing. You'd start spitting. You'd have chewing tobacco. You'd play cards, which, a woman of refinement at the time would never be caught spitting, chewing tobacco. She'd never be playing cards. She wouldn't be swearing. So you had to do what you had to do to fit in. And then at the time, cross-dressing just wasn't a thing. You just never thought that you'd be walking down the street looking at a woman dressed as a man with short hair wearing trousers. Now, women working on farms with your family, I'm sure you could get away with pulling up your skirts and having trousers underneath, but it's just not something you would have done in public. So the idea really just didn't cross their mind because of the ideals at the time. And if you think about it, we're in 2025 and cross-dressing is still a controversial topic today for some people. So you can imagine how controversial it was in the 1860s. This is a picture of myself. I was caught for being an imposter and I was put under court-martial. Unfortunately, at the time, women weren't allowed on juries, so you can imagine that I was convicted. So how were the female soldiers discovered during the war? The most common way that they were discovered was wounds. If you are wounded on a battlefield and they think that you're going to survive your wounds through surgery or just through being nursed back to health, they would take you to a field hospital. And there they would have to address your wounds, which means they're going to have to strip you down. If you have an injury to your chest, your abdomen, your arms, they're going to have to take your top off, and they're going to realize that you have breasts and that you're a woman. If they have to take your pants off, they're going to realize that you have a vagina and that you're a woman. So unfortunately, a lot of these women were discovered through their wounds, either by being taken to a hospital and surviving them or dying on the battlefield. Illness killed more people during the Civil War than battle wounds did. Dysentery was running rampant. You had bad water, you had bad food, you were around people from different parts of the country for the first time, so these germs were new to you. So again, if you're ill for an extended period of time, you're going to end up in a field hospital where eventually you're going to have to change your clothes. They're going to want to bathe you, they're going to want to put you in a different outfit at some point. Death. So if you die on the battlefield, they need to try and identify your body. They're going to look for things on your person that they can, write a letter home to your family. They didn't have dog tags back then, so a lot of soldiers would sew their name into the collar of their shirt or their hat, or they'd have a family picture with them or a letter for a loved one. But if you were a woman disguising yourself as a man, you're not going to have those things on your person. So they're probably going to start taking off items of clothing and discovering, oh, hey, this person is actually a woman. Women soldiers were taken prisoner during the Civil War. Just like male soldiers, women soldiers, if you get swept up in the crowd and you're taken prisoner and sent to a prisoner of war camp, eventually you're probably going to be found out because you would be in very confined quarters. Again, you're going to have to use the bathroom at some point, and it's not like you had privacy when you were a prisoner of war, so you'd be using the bathroom in front of other people, and at some point you're probably going to change your clothes and be found out. Giving birth was also something that actually happened. So back to the point of women losing their menstrual cycles, some women genuinely joined the army not realizing that they were already pregnant. In 1860 something, you did not have a pregnancy test. You could not go to Walmart and pee on a stick and find out that you were pregnant. You had to wait to lose your menstrual cycle, and then you had to wait to feel the baby kick. And you had to wait for your body to change. If you are not eating correctly, if you are not resting, if you're marching 25 miles a day in the heat, you're not going to be gaining weight. Your body's not going to be making those changes. You might not feel the baby move, and you might say, oh, I lost my menstrual cycle because of the stress and the weight loss that I have. So a lot of women that found themselves pregnant during the Civil War would give birth unknowingly. They would just go into labor and give birth. There's a TV show, I think it was like, I don't know that I'm pregnant. And it was about women who didn't know they were pregnant. And everyone's like, that's crazy. How can you not know? But it actually happens. And there's a story of a woman, she was actually on picket duty. I think she was a corporal. And she went into labor, and one of the soldiers wrote home and said, hey, our corporal gave birth to a bouncing baby boy, and we named him Johnny. And then they sent her and the baby home. They were like, you can't stay. But it really did happen. And some women, you had a battle buddy. You were sleeping 2 people or 4 people to a tent, and on cold nights, you're cuddling. Maybe your bedmate finds out you're a woman, and you get pregnant while being in the army. So that happened too. And then some women were discovered because they were just too womanly. They were too feminine. They couldn't fit in. I can't imagine what it would be like if my life depended on pretending to be a man. I could probably pull it off for like a day or two, but I know when I reenact, people right away are like, oh no, that's a girl, that's a female soldier, and I'm like, dang it. But I'm not willing to cut off all of my hair just for reenacting. But there's a story of a soldier. She was used to using her apron to carry things, so a soldier threw her an apple and she went to catch it with her apron. Well, she didn't have an apron on, she was dressed as a soldier. So they were like, hey, what's that guy doing? And it gave her away. And then what would happen to female soldiers when they were discovered? So you're discovered, what are they gonna do with you? Most of them were just sent home without punishment. A lot of these women truly had the best of intentions. They were joining the army for a great cause. They wanted to preserve the Union, or they wanted to preserve the Confederacy. And they did it without trying to harm anyone. They were good soldiers. They did what they were supposed to do, and they were just discovered by happenstance. So they would be sent home. Some women were imprisoned. You were really doing something illegal at the time. If you were trying to enlist in the Army underage, if you were trying to enlist in the Army as a woman, these things weren't allowed. So if you got caught, you were, committing a crime, so you could end up in prison. And in some cases, these women would be institutionalized. Again, just like today, how cross-dressing or the LGBTQ community is controversial for some people, this was very controversial at the time. They didn't have a good grasp on mental health. They didn't have a good grasp on the fact that women could wear trousers and not be crazy. So they would send them to institutions. And it wasn't something that was very hard to do back then. You could institutionalize people. You could go there and say, my wife just cries too much. She's too emotional. Okay, she's crazy, put her in the institution. So you can imagine a woman running away from home, pretending to be a man, taking on an entirely new persona, carrying a gun, killing people. You can understand why a woman would end up being institutionalized for something like that. As sad as it is, they had the best of intentions, but it didn't always work out very well for them. And then I like to give you some examples of actual female soldiers. So our first is Sarah Emma Edmonds Seeley, and she went by the name of Franklin Flint Thompson, and she was in the 2nd Michigan Infantry. Now this is a picture of her as a woman, but you can see from her features, maybe if she had a hat on and a uniform, she could pass as a more masculine man. She was a private in the Union Army, and she also served as a spy and as a nurse. She ended up writing her story, which is really the only reason we know about her service. She wrote Nurse and Spy in the Union Army, and the first edition was released in 1864 after her time in the Army. Franklin Thompson was cleared of desertion charges, and she was awarded a pension in 1884. So that is very unusual. It did not matter how good of a soldier you were. If they found out you were female, no go, no pension. We don't want you. That's embarrassing to us that we even let you in. We should have found out about you before. So the fact that she was able to get a pension is very telling. And then Edmonds was actually admitted into the Grand Army of the Republic, and she's the only female member, and that happened in 1897. And in 1901, she was reburied with military honors at Washington Cemetery in Houston. So she is really a shining example of the fact that women could do this, and it be taboo and it be illegal at the time, but then were celebrated later in life. I noted earlier that the only reason we know about her service is because she wrote a book. A lot of these women, if they were doing it right, you never knew it happened. They went through the war, and they either deserted when it was time. A lot of women would be, people would be suspicious of them, and they'd say, okay, it's time for me to leave, and they'd desert, and they might either rejoin a different unit or they might just go home. And at the time, it was pretty easy to get away with this kind of thing, because if you get on a train and you go a couple 100 miles from home, no one knows you. There's not cell phones, there's not internet, no one's gonna know where you went or what happened to you. And if you just show back up at home, no one's gonna believe that you ran away and joined the Army. They're gonna think you were out with, you ran away and eloped or something. No one's gonna say, oh, you've been a female soldier for the last 2 years. So a lot of women would just desert, or they would make it through the war, they would survive, they would outlast their enlistment, and they would go home. And if they wanted people to know about it, they would write their stories. If they didn't want people to know about it, they wouldn't tell anyone. And that's why we just don't know for sure how many women did this. But a lot of women discovered during the Civil War, unfortunately for researchers, that they could sell their stories. So there were women that never left home, that made up these amazing stories and wrote books and sold their stories to newspaper articles and became really famous and made it into textbooks. And then later we found out they lied about the whole thing. But I get it. If I was, say, in the Confederacy and my entire way of life was turned upside down and I had no money, I had no income, and I had kids to take care of, I could probably come up with a pretty good story and try and sell it for some money too. But there are definitely people that we've been able to confirm their stories. There's other people that we just still don't know if it's true or not. This is a great one. Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, she went by Private Lyons Wakeman of the 153rd New York Infantry, and this, to me, she really passes as a man. This, I would not look at her at first glance and think that's a woman. I wouldn't do a double take. I'd say, yep, that's a soldier, go for it. She was a private in the Union Army, and on May 3rd, she reported to the hospital suffering from chronic diarrhea. So that's dysentery at the time. And again, that was really the main cause for disease and death during the Civil War. She ended up being transferred to a hospital in New Orleans, and she arrived there on May 22nd. And by that time, she was gravely ill. So between May 3rd and May 22nd, she really went downhill. And then, unfortunately, she died on June 19th, 1864. But there was no record of her true sex having ever been discovered. She was not discovered the entire time that she was in the military or that she was in the hospital. How she pulled that off, I'm not sure. Maybe she was just so sick that they didn't really try and move her or do much with her. They probably were just trying to give her fluids and get her to eat. But she was buried under her alias, Private Lyons Wakeman, at the National Cemetery near New Orleans. So she died and was buried as a male Civil War soldier. And she ended up writing letters home during her time in the Army, and she had written to her family, I don't know how long before I shall have to go into the field for battle, but for my part, I don't care, and I don't feel afraid to go. So she was an incredible brave woman and clearly had a lot of patriotism. And it wasn't until, her family came forward and said, we have these letters from our daughter, from our sister, from our aunt, that people even knew that this Private Lyons Wakeman was actually Sarah Rosetta Wakeman. So that is one of the examples of someone who was able to make it through and not be discovered during their lifetime. And then a different kind of female soldier, so you can tell that this woman looks like a woman, is dressed like a woman. This is Marie Tepe, Fearless French Mary. So she is an example of someone who followed their husband to war. She enlisted with her husband in the 27th Pennsylvania Infantry, but she didn't enlist as a man. She worked in the regimental hospital, she sold goods, and she carried a 1.5-gallon keg of whiskey or water with her at all times. So that's what she's carrying with that strap. So they left her stick around. She was more than a camp follower, but she wasn't a soldier. And what we call that today is a viandière. And that comes from the Zouaves. The Zouaves were a part of the army that styled themselves after French military. They wore baggy pants, they had a funny-looking hat with a tassel on it, and jackets like she's wearing. And she ended up being a vivandière for the 114th Pennsylvania Zouaves after she was with the 27th Pennsylvania Infantry. There she worked as a sutler, which is someone that sold goods, a merchant. She was a cook, she was a washwoman, and she sewed for the regiment. So she really earned her keep. This wasn't a woman that was just tagging along, taking up resources. She really put in her time. Tepe ended up receiving a soldier's pay with an additional 25 cents for each day that she spent working at the regimental hospital, and she was awarded the Kearney Cross. So the vivandières really started in Europe during those wars, and then it was something that was adopted here in America. So the women would take a male's uniform, they'd wear the trousers under a skirt, they'd wear a shirt, they'd have a Zouave's jacket. Sometimes they would wear a floppy hat, and they had the keg of water or whiskey. They would go out onto the battlefield after a battle, and they would offer comfort to the soldiers. If you were lying there wounded, someone coming to you with some whiskey to drink or some water to drink would be a great comfort. So she really made a name for herself. And if you look up the word vivandière, you're going to see Marie Tepe. I mean, she's just synonymous with that term. The 87th, our reenacting unit, actually had a vivandière for a few years. Mrs. Dasher, her and her husband joined after their son showed interest in reenacting, and they were with us until their son graduated college and got a job as a park ranger. So she's retired from reenacting, but she did a great impression, and her uniform looked exactly like this, and she got to carry a pistol, because you were very close to the front line, so you had to protect yourself. And you also wanted to protect the goods that you were selling and your whiskey. You didn't want it stolen by a drunk soldier or, someone just coming along and trying to get you. So it's cool that they were as close to a female soldier as you could get without pretending to be a male soldier. And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Harriet Tubman. So Harriet Tubman was a former slave. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. I'm from Newberry Township, northern York County. Harriet Tubman actually stayed for a night at a farmhouse in Newberry Township that we know was a part of the Underground Railroad. There was a free black family, Eliza Baptist and her husband, Ezekiel, and they had Harriet Tubman into their home one evening. She stayed there, so that's a pretty cool claim to fame for little Newberry Township. And she was a Union cook and a nurse. So here is a former slave, now a free black woman working for the Union Army. And she ended up becoming a Union spy. And I like to use this as an example because while she wasn't a soldier, while she wasn't dressing up as a man, she was doing all of the things that a soldier would do. And being a spy is pretty high up there. So Tubman became the first woman in the country's history to lead a military expedition. She helped Colonel James Montgomery plan a night raid to free slaves from rice plantations along the Combahee River. So a lot of people think of Harriet Tubman just as an icon of the Underground Railroad, but she's so much more than that. She really did many different things, from cooking to nursing to being a spy. So she's definitely someone that when I talk about female soldiers, I like to highlight her, not only because of Black history, women's history, but just because she really crossed not only color barriers, but she also crossed, into a man's world by being a spy and leading a military expedition. And then we have a woman from the Confederacy. So before this, we were talking about Union women. So this is a Confederate woman, Maria Isabella Bell Boyd, and she was a Confederate spy. Women were utilized as spies because who's going to suspect a well-bred Victorian-era woman? You're dressed to the nines, wearing a hoop skirt, you're very refined, you're not going to say a bad word, you're not going to step out of line, you're not going to take your bonnet off, you're not going to take your gloves off. So it's perfect. You can hide a lot under a hoop skirt. You'd be surprised how much stuff you can smuggle in a corset and a hoop skirt. So the Union Army and the press, they didn't like her, and they dubbed her La Belle Rebelle, Siren of the Shenandoah, and the Rebel Joan of Arc. So she really made a name for herself. And of course, just like many women before her, she wrote her stories down and made a lot of money off of them. She wrote Belle Boyd in Camp and Prison, which was published in 1865. She ended up being captured and put in a military prison, a prisoner of war camp, with her daughter. She brought her daughter along with her. She was a single mother, and again, that was one of the reasons that she was utilized as a spy, because no one's going to suspect this well-refined, well-bred mother with a young 5-6-year-old daughter. But they discovered later on that you could take a little baby doll, you could unscrew its head, hide a note in it, screw it on, give it to the little girl. You're going to pass through camp, no one's going to suspect anything. You're going to cross enemy lines, no one's going to suspect the mother and the daughter. So having her daughter with her sort of gave her the perfect cover, and she couldn't just abandon her daughter, so she brought her daughter along with her to prison. I mean, today, that would be absolutely crazy. No one's like, I'm going to bring my 5-year-old to prison with me for however long this lasts. But she did, and thankfully they both survived. Even though that she was a Confederate and she was the enemy, it would be horrible to see a mother and her young daughter die in prison. She parlayed that success from her book into being an actress and a lecturer, and her show was called The Perils of a Spy. And she went to London, all across Europe, all across America. She really made a name for herself, and that's one of the reasons the Union Army and the press really didn't like her. It was like, okay, not only are you the enemy, but now you're making money off of the fact that you duped us. So, but apparently she was considered a great beauty at the time, and I'm sure that also helped. Loose lips sink ships. She was having some high-ranking military officers into her home. She was plying them with some alcohol. They'd start talking in front of her, and she could share some stories with the Confederates. And then we have camp followers. So I think a lot of people that don't do research into the Civil War and just know what they've learned from their middle school textbooks or their trips to Gettysburg know what a camp follower is. So women, usually their children and the wives of the soldiers, would follow along behind the soldiers. So the soldiers would have their own camp, and then a little ways off, maybe a mile or two, or maybe even closer, women and children would set up their own camp. And they would cook, and they would do the wash, and they would sew for the soldiers. And this was really credited with boosting the troops' morale. You're away from home for the first time, you have a young family, and having the women and the children around to bring you those creature comforts and to make you feel more at home, more alive, really helped the soldiers, because you have to have happy soldiers if you want to win the war. So having these women around really helped, and they were extra hands. During the Civil War, nurses and doctors were under extreme stress. There were doctors that literally died while doing amputations because they were working for over 24 hours straight, and they were getting dehydrated and exhausted. And they just didn't have enough skilled nurses, enough skilled doctors. So having these women on hand to be able to help with the little things, like, oh, someone has a graze wound that, just needs stitched up. Someone, hit their head and they just need some ice put on it. Someone's dehydrated, they just need water. These women could step in and do those things. And then you didn't have to pay the camp followers for their work. They were cooking for their family. A lot of times they would pool the camp resources together to make big meals for everybody, but you weren't giving them a cook's pay, you weren't giving them a pension. So it was free labor basically, and you were keeping your troops happy. And then one of the last things I like to finish with is the sex workers of the Civil War. This is a topic that really doesn't get enough coverage. It's a taboo topic. It's not something people like to talk about. Even in 2025, sex work is very controversial. But for women during the 1860s, it was about survival. So women needed to support themselves while their husbands and their male relatives were away at war, especially in the South. Sherman said, we're going to go through the South and we're going to burn everything to the ground until we get to the coast. And he did. And a lot of these women relied on their husbands' plantations, their fathers' plantations. They relied on, working in town. And if your town is completely burnt down and you have no way to make money and support your family, sex work was a way that women could do that. Nashville and Memphis ended up having government-sanctioned prostitution during the Civil War. So you can imagine, even in 2025, that's not a thing that happens. You can't just go to downtown Nashville and legally pick up a prostitute, but you could during the Civil War. The reason that it ended up being government sanctioned is because so many soldiers were getting sick with STDs. And by government sanctioning it, not only did it protect the soldier and the prostitute from illness because they were checking them for disease on a regular basis, it also kept the women safe from men that would rough them up or steal their money or take advantage of them. And it would keep the soldier safe from maybe a prostitute trying to steal their money or take advantage of them. So really it was for the safety of the women and for the health of the soldiers that it ended up being a government-sanctioned practice. Erotic literature and pornography could be bought by soldiers through the mail. So just like today, pornography and sex work was something that was happening during the Civil War. A lot of men would have pornographic pictures on their playing cards when they would gamble and play cards. So there was stories that when you went into battle, you left your pack of cards back at camp. Because God forbid you died in battle and they found out that you had porn in your pocket and told your wife, or your mother found out. So, it was something that was going on, but it was still something you kind of kept quiet. Prostitution boosted morale for the soldiers. Again, happy soldiers means that they're going to do better in battle, that they're going to want to fight for you and do a good job. So if it meant letting the men go off one night a week to the brothel, then so be it. Many soldiers, again, complained of what they called the pox and the clap, nicknames for STDs, and that's why it became a government-sanctioned practice in the South. It never became government-sanctioned in the North, but there definitely was a lookout to try and make sure that these soldiers were not being infected, because you can't have soldiers running around with different diseases and still being able to fight. There's an old wives' tale that the reason hookers are called hookers is because of Joseph Hooker from the Civil War. But we've found through research that the term hooker was in use since 1845 to talk about prostitutes. So Joseph Hooker is not responsible for the nickname, but it makes a good story. It sounds good, but just if you say it in front of me, I'll call you out and say that's not true. For the latter half of the 1800s, there was at least 2 major red light districts right in the center of DC, within sight of the White House. So you can imagine what that would be like today. That would just set some tongues wagging. One of the most notorious was Hooker's division. So again, this is why Joseph Hooker and his division during the Civil War is so entwined with the wives' tale of why hookers are called hookers. On the west end of the Federal Triangle and on the right of the National Mall, so if you can picture DC if you've ever been there and start orienting yourself here, with the White House to the north and the Capitol to the east and the business district within walking distance, it was perfectly positioned. This is the red light district. The area got its name during the Civil War when Union General Hooker moved everything seedy in the Capitol to a choice few spots, and the division was one such place. The name was also at least partially arose from how often Hooker's men visited that district. Hint, a lot. And the Evening Star had this to say about Hooker's division back in 1863. There are at present more houses of this character, ill repute, by 10 times in the city than have ever existed here before, and loose characters can now be counted by the thousands. And that's a quote from Donna Sheriff, and she has a book called Within Sight of the White House, The Archaeology of Working Women, and that was back in 1991. But Joseph Hooker, unfortunately for him and his family, will always be synonymous with the red light district and hookers because his men used the brothel a lot. But again, it helped with morale. And he's not responsible for the term hooker, but at least here in America, the term is definitely synonymous with him and the use of prostitutes during the Civil War. But after the Civil War, the practice started to die out. There wasn't a need anymore, supply and demand went down, life was starting to get back to normal, Reconstruction was happening in the South, the men were going back to their families, there wasn't a need for these brothels and for the mass prostitution that there was. But I always like to highlight these women truly were just trying to survive. It wasn't something seedy, it wasn't something perverted. They really just were looking out of desperation for a way to make money and keep themselves and their children and their families alive during this war, because the North had it much easier. We had industry, we had the railroad system. Our soldiers were getting their pay almost every month. They were getting their rations. In the South, it was not like that, and I'm not an apologist for the South. I am not a fan of the Confederacy, but I do think that the civilian women especially had a very, very rough time during the Civil War, and I do feel very bad that the women had to turn to this work, but it was honest work, and it was something that helped keep them alive during the Civil War. But that is the end of my presentation. I have some resources up here that I used on my presentation, but if you have any questions or comments, I'd welcome them. If not, thanks for coming out tonight. I know it's hot. I'm sure the heat kept some people away, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very interesting. I initially thought that the talk was going to be, like, I didn't realize it was about women who were pretending to be men for the most part. I thought that women maybe were allowed to enlist in the Civil War, so I really learned a lot. I thought that was very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for coming out tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Everybody else is at the carnival, I guess.
Yeah, probably.